In 1871 Mississippi, a war widow feeds her pigs well, and the overseer who once ruled her farm vanishes without a trace. Neighbors whisper that the swamp took him, but what lingers behind the barn tells a different story. A blood-caked trough, a bone too clean to be animal. And when the drought drops the swamp line, something sharp and rusted surfaces near the pig sluice. Behind the widow's calm eyes lies a secret carved in flesh, not memory. What did she serve that winter? And who helped her do it? If you would like me to continue creating stories so that this history, which is not taught in schools, is not forgotten, please subscribe to this channel. Write in the comments where you are watching from. The winter air bit sharp as Edgar Pruitt dismounted his mule near the pig enclosure at Ash Farm. His boots left deep prints in the frozen mud as he secured the animal to a fence post, its breath creating ghost-like clouds in the fading light. The leather ledger tucked under his arm had grown worn at the corners from months of daily use, recording debts and infractions with equal precision. He tested the weight of the leather strap in his right hand. Its surface cracked and darkened from regular use. The pigs stirred in their pen, pressing against the wooden slats as they caught his scent. Their grunting echoed across the empty fields that stretched toward the cypress swamp. Inside the main house, a single lamp burned behind lace curtains. Josephine Ash's silhouette passed briefly across the window, then vanished. Pruitt spat a stream of tobacco juice into the frost-killed grass. "Time to settle accounts," he muttered, heading toward the barn. 3 days later, Mason Hollow's post office became a hub of whispered speculation. The morning stage arrived without Pruitt's weekly report to the county office. By afternoon, his absence at the cotton exchange raised eyebrows among the merchants who relied on his meticulous documentation. At the Wesson Ferry Tavern, 9 miles south along the mud-rutted road, the barkeep recalled Pruitt's final visit. "Came in full of fire," he told anyone who'd listen. "Drank 4 whiskeys straight and talked big about teaching someone proper respect." Said the widow needed reminding who held authority now. The temperature dropped further that week, turning the Mississippi mud to iron. Ice formed along the Homachito River's edge, making ferry crossings treacherous. When Sheriff Miles Tabor finally rode out to Ash Farm, frost covered his mustache and his cane tapped hollow against the frozen ground. He found Josephine Ash in her parlor, straight-backed in her widow's black, a silver cross at her throat catching the weak winter light. Her hands remained folded in her lap as she recounted Pruitt's departure. "He left at dawn 4 days past," she stated, her voice carrying the practiced calm of long suffering. "Spoke of buying mules in Franklinton." "I've not seen him since." Tabor noted how her tenant workers avoided his gaze when questioned, their answers coming in whispers and half-sentences. Something in their manner made his neck prickle, but he couldn't name it. Behind the barn, the pig pen stood silent. The animals huddled against the cold, steam rising from their backs. Tabor's eyes caught on the feeding trough, a long wooden channel stained dark despite the freezing temperatures. The discoloration seemed wrong somehow, too red against the weathered wood. That evening, Sheriff Tabor sent a rider to fetch Dr. Elias Cobb. His message was brief but urgent. "Come examine the feed trough at Ash Farm. Bring your medical kit. Something ain't natural about these stains." January 5th, 1871. Dawn crept across Mason Hollow's frost-glazed fields as Dr. Elias Cobb guided his mare through the iron-hard mud toward Ash Farm. His medical satchel, worn from years of battlefield service, bumped against his hip with each step. Through the morning fog, he could make out the dark shapes of the pig enclosure where Sheriff Tabor waited, leaning heavily on his cane. The cold made Cobb's old war wound ache. His left leg dragged slightly as he dismounted, boots crunching on frozen grass. Steam rose from the pig pen in ghostly wisps, carrying a metallic smell that made his nose twitch. The animals huddled together, unusually quiet for feeding time. "Over here, Doctor," Tabor called, gesturing toward the wooden trough with his cane. "Need your medical opinion on these markings." Cobb adjusted his wire-rimmed spectacles and knelt beside the feeding channel. Years of examining battlefield wounds had trained his eye to read the stories blood could tell. The stains along the wood grain spoke of recent violence, too red, too fresh for simple butchering. In places, the liquid had mixed with the frozen slop, creating marble-like patterns of pink and brown. Using a small probe from his satchel, he scraped at the congealed matter caught between the trough's boards. "This residue," he muttered, holding it up to the weak morning light. "Fatty deposits. Human tissue has a distinct composition." His words trailed off as movement caught his eye. In an upstairs window of the main house, Josephine Ash stood watching, her black dress stark against the white curtains. She made no gesture of acknowledgement, her face a pale oval in the glass. Sheriff Tabor shifted uncomfortably. "Without a body, ain't much I can do. No warrant judge'll sign off on just some bloodied pig slop." Cobb's probe found something else, a small, hard object embedded in the frozen muck. He extracted it carefully, a brass button, the kind commonly sewn onto men's work shirts. Before he could examine it closer, one of the larger pigs shouldered forward, snuffling eagerly. The button disappeared into the creature's mouth with a single gulp. "These animals," Cobb said quietly, "they've been fed something unusual. The consistency of what's left in the slurry pit." He gestured toward the drainage channel where waste collected. "It contains material not typical of standard livestock feed." Tabor glanced toward the house again. "Ain't natural, perhaps, but ain't evidence neither. Best leave it be, Doctor." Back in his surgery that evening, Cobb's trembling hands penned a letter he knew he wouldn't send. His physician's ledger lay open beside him, its pages filled with careful notes from years of county service. "To the office of county coroner," he wrote, "I feel compelled to report findings observed this day at Ash Farm. The feeding trough and associated swine waste contained significant quantities of blood and tissue matter, which, based on my medical experience, may originate from a mammalian source not usually butchered." He detailed his observations with clinical precision, noting the temperature, tissue consistency, and suspicious presence of human-made articles in the pig pen. At the bottom, he added the date, January 5th, 1871, and his initials, E.C. The letter, folded precisely, disappeared between the pages of his personal ledger. There it would stay, one more secret held in Mason Hollow's frozen soil. January 7th, 1871. The church bells of Brookhaven rang clear across the frost-hardened fields, their sound carrying for miles through the still winter air. But at Ash Farm, no one prepared for worship. Instead, a cluster of tenant families gathered in the yard before the main house, their breath visible in the morning chill. Sheriff Tabor's horse stamped restlessly in the packed dirt as he questioned Silas Nash. The former slave's face bore the marks of an overseer's whip, old scars that pulled tight when he spoke. Behind him, other workers stood silent, their eyes fixed on the ground. "Tell me again what you saw Wednesday night," Tabor demanded, thumb hooked in his gun belt. Silas kept his hands folded at his waist, speaking slowly. "Like I said before, sir." Mr. Pruitt came round sunset, walked toward the barn, carrying his ledger and that strap he favored. "That's all I saw. Heard nothing after." "No, sir, nothing at all." His son Thaddeus stood close by, fingers working a piece of frayed clothesline he'd fashioned into a fishing rig. The boy's eyes darted between his father and the second-floor window, where Josephine Ashe observed the gathering, her silhouette rigid against the glass. "Boy," Tabor called, making Thaddeus jump. "You see anything that night?" Before the child could answer, Silas's hand found his son's shoulder. "He was already abed, sir." We all were. The other tenants nodded in agreement. Too quickly, Tabor thought. Their unified silence felt rehearsed, like a hymn sung from memory. From the house came the sharp rap of Josephine's cane against wood. The front door opened, and she emerged wearing her customary black, a leather pouch clutched in one gloved hand. Without addressing the sheriff, she moved among her tenants, pressing coins into palms. "Your week's wages," she announced, her voice carrying clearly in the cold air, "plus a little extra for the holiday." She paused beside Silas. "The Lord provide for those who keep his commandments." Tabor watched the exchange with narrowed eyes. "Mighty generous, paying out early." Josephine turned to face him, her spine straight as a fence post. "The Sabbath reminds us of our obligations, Sheriff, to God and neighbor alike." Her dark eyes swept across the gathered workers. "I trust my people know their duties." The meaning was clear. One by one, the tenants pocketed their coins and drifted away, leaving Tabor alone with his unanswered questions. By noon, his report lay finished on his desk in Brookhaven. No evidence of foul play. No body recovered. Case suspended pending new information. 2 days later, a traveling peddler named Samuel Whitfield made his regular stop in Mason Hollow. In his personal ledger, between entries for cotton thread and tin buttons, he recorded a curious transaction. January 9th, 1871. Traded with widow. Ashe. 6 yards of black lace and 2 prayer books in exchange for fresh jowl meat, still warm from butcher. Says her pigs are fed special. Meat has strange texture, but price was fair. January 14th, 1871. The coal stove in the Brookhaven County office barely pushed back the morning chill as Deputy Clerk Mary Ann Wills spread the plantation ledgers across her desk. Her fingers, red from cold, traced down columns of numbers and dates, searching for any record of livestock processing at Ashe Farm. The leather-bound books held every transaction meant to be recorded in the county: cotton weights, timber sales, livestock births, and slaughters. But as she flipped through December and early January entries, something didn't add up. "Mr. Harrison," she called to the senior clerk, "have you seen any hog processing permits from Ashe Farm recently?" Harrison shuffled over, adjusting his wire-rimmed spectacles. "Nothing since November's autumn butchering. Why do you ask?" Mary Ann pulled out a stack of market receipts collected from Brookhaven's town square. "Because I'm holding sales records for fresh pork." January 10th and 11th. Josephine Ashe's mark is clear as day on both. She laid them side by side. 2 transactions, less than 24 hours apart. The first showed 3 pounds of shoulder meat, sold to the Mason boarding house. The second listed jowl cuts and fresh crackling traded to the milliner's wife. Perhaps she forgot to file the processing papers, Harrison suggested, but his frown deepened. Every plantation widow knew the rules. No livestock could be butchered without proper documentation, especially under Reconstruction oversight. The office door creaked open, letting in a blast of winter air along with Tom Whitaker, the Wesson Tavern keeper, come to pay his quarterly license fees. As he warmed his hands by the stove, he mentioned the strange weather keeping folks close to home. "Reminds me of that nasty night 2 weeks back," he said, stamping his boots, "when that overseer Pruitt was in, drinking like a fish before heading out to Ash Farm. 4 whiskeys, and him already swaying. Asked me the quickest way there, though he'd made that ride plenty." Mary Ann's hand stilled over the ledgers. "What night was this exactly?" "Let me think. January 3rd it was. Remember because he paid with a bright new coin, said he'd just collected his month's wages." Whitaker shrugged. "Haven't seen him since, come to think of it." Harrison cleared his throat. "Did you report this to Sheriff Tabor?" "Didn't seem worth mentioning at the time. Man's got a right to drink, doesn't he? Though he was in a dark mood, muttering about teaching someone respect or some such nonsense." Outside, snow began to fall. Thick, heavy flakes that would soon block the roads between towns. Telegraph lines already sagged with ice, slowing communication to a crawl. Any riders carrying news or official inquiries between counties would be delayed for days. The next morning, Ben Mills, who ran the general store, took down the wanted poster that had hung on his community board since January 8th. The rough sketch of Edgar Pruitt's face, the heavy jaw, the tobacco-stained beard, had drawn no leads. "Missing overseer," it read. "Edgar Pruitt, age 41. Last seen vicinity of Mason Hollow. Reward for information leading to whereabouts." Mills folded the paper carefully, tucking it into his ledger. Another drifter gone missing on winter roads, or so everyone chose to believe. January 17th, 1871. The sun hung low over Mason Hollow as Reverend Isaiah Poole guided his tired mare down the muddy track to Ash Farm. His saddlebags, worn leather creaking with each step, held collection envelopes from the morning's rounds, cornmeal, dried beans, and a few precious coins for the Winter Poor Fund. The widow's house rose before him, its weathered columns casting long shadows across the front yard. 2 fat hogs waddled near the fence line, their backs broad and glossy, despite the lean season. Poole noted their size with quiet interest. Most farmers' stock grew thin by mid-January, when feed stores ran low. Josephine Ash appeared at the door before he could knock, her black dress pristine, her face composed beneath the widow's cap. "Reverend Poole," she said, voice cool as the afternoon air, "what brings you to my door?" "Collection for the winter poor, Mrs." "Ash," he replied, removing his hat. "The cold's been fierce this year. Many families are struggling." She gestured him into the front parlor, where a small fire barely touched the chill. As she went to fetch her contribution, Poole's gaze drifted through the window toward the smokehouse. Its weathered door stood slightly ajar, releasing wisps of fresh cure smoke into the grey sky. "Something troubles you, Reverend?" Josephine asked, returning with a basket. "I notice your smokehouse is active," he said carefully. "A blessing to have such plenty in winter." "The Lord provides," she answered, setting down preserved peaches pickled, beans, and 3 silver coins. "We must share his bounty, as Scripture teaches." Poole's nostrils flared slightly at the metallic tang drifting from the smokehouse, sharper than the sweet hickory that usually flavored winter meat. Indeed, though I don't recall hearing of any recent butchering. We process as need requires, Josephine said. Her dark eyes met his, unflinching. Will these offerings suffice? They will serve God's purpose, he replied, packing away the donations. Though his eyes see all our works, Mrs. Ash, every secret thing, whether it be good or whether it be evil. Ecclesiastes, she nodded. You know your verses well, Reverend. But perhaps you should consider Proverbs 21:23. Whoso keepeth his mouth and his tongue keepeth his soul from troubles. Later that evening, as Poole recorded the day's collections in the church ledger, a small figure appeared in his study doorway. Young Thaddeus Nash, the tenant boy, twisted his cap in trembling hands. Reverend, he whispered, I got to tell somebody. About the pigs. Poole set down his pen. What about the pigs, child? They eat more than just corn now, Thaddeus said, voice cracking. Since that night, the night Mr. Pruitt. He stopped, shuddering. Poole drew out a fresh sheet of paper, dated it carefully, and wrote what the boy told him in his precise hand. When finished, he sealed the document with wax and locked it in the church strong-box. Outside, the first drops of rain began to fall. By midnight, the storm had swollen the creek behind Ash Farm into a torrent. Muddy water churned through the swamp, rising past the pig pen and washing away the rutted trail that led toward the backfields. Whatever secrets lay buried in that sodden earth, the flood waters claimed them all. The sun beat mercilessly on Thaddeus Nash's bare shoulders as he crouched by the swamp's sluice gate, now exposed after months without rain. His fishing line, made from braided cotton threads, stolen from his mother's sewing basket, dangled in the murky water. The drought had pushed the waterline back 20 feet, revealing a graveyard of stumps and trash that normally lay hidden beneath the surface. Crawdads weren't biting today. The water was too warm, too shallow. Thaddeus poked at the mud with a stick, watching tiny bubbles rise and pop. Something glinted in the muck between two cypress knees. He leaned forward, squinting against the glare. Metal. Not a tin can or broken plough piece, but something smaller. Curved. Thaddeus waded into the tepid water, mud squishing between his toes. His fingers closed around the object, a rusted iron spur, its rowel still sharp despite months under water. As he pulled it free, something else came with it, tangled in the reeds and waterweeds. A bone, long and pale, stripped clean by time and water. But what made his breath catch wasn't the bone itself, it was the marks. Deep grooves crossed the surface in precise parallel lines. Too regular to be animal teeth, his amasul. Hands shook as he gathered both items. The spur had letters stamped into its heel band. E.P. in worn but readable script. Thaddeus knew those initials. Everyone did. He ran home, bare feet slapping against the packed earth. His father Silas stood in their cabin doorway, wiping sweat from his scarred face with a kerchief. One look at his son's wide eyes told him something was wrong. "What you got there, boy?" Thaddeus held out his finds. Silas took them carefully, turning the spur over in his calloused hands. His expression hardened when he saw the initials. "Where'd you find these?" "By the sluice gate." The water's real low now. Silas wrapped both items in his kerchief. "Stay here with your mama." "I'm going to see Reverend Poole." The Reverend was in his study when Silas arrived, writing his Sunday sermon. He set down his pen as Silas placed the bundle on his desk. "Brother Nash, what brings you here?" Silas unwrapped the kerchief. My boy found these in the swamp behind Ash Farm. Water's down on account of the drought. Reverend Poole examined the items closely, his finger tracing the carved lines on the bone. This wasn't done by nature, he said quietly. These marks were made by human hands. And these initials, Edgar Pruitt, Silas whispered, his fancy riding spur. The Reverend opened his desk drawer and removed a folded paper. This came in with last week's church donations, a page torn from a peddler's account book, dated January 9th. Lists a trade with Mrs. Ash, lace for fresh pork. He looked up at Silas. 4 days after Pruitt disappeared. Standing, Reverend Poole carefully wrapped the bone and spur in clean linen. I need to take these to Brookhaven, to the recorder's office. He paused, studying Silas's face. You understand what this means? Yes, Reverend. I reckon I do. Then pray for justice, Brother Nash. Pray hard. The Reverend's horse kicked up dust on the noon-baked road as he rode toward Brookhaven, the wrapped evidence secure in his saddlebag. Behind him, the swamp's dark waters held their silence, waiting for the next secret to surface. June 4th, 1871. Sawmill smoke drifted through the open windows of the Brookhaven County Recorder's office, making the oil lamps flicker. Deputy Jethro Reams adjusted his wire-rimmed spectacles, his left sleeve pinned empty at the shoulder. A reminder of Shiloh. Before him lay the scattered pieces of the Pruitt disappearance, the newly discovered spur, the scored bone, and 5 months of dusty silence. Tell me again, mister. Nash, Reams said, dipping his pen. From the beginning. Silas Nash sat stiffly in the wooden chair, his straw hat crushed between weathered hands. Sweat darkened the collar of his cotton shirt, despite the early hour. It was past sunset, January 3rd. I was checking the fence line near the barn. Your regular duties? Yes, sir. We had loose pigs that week. Silas's fingers worked the hat brim. That's when I heard the shouting. Pruitt had Mrs. Ash by the wrist, dragging her toward the barn door. She wasn't fighting exactly, but she wasn't willing neither. Sheriff Tabor's chair scraped the floorboards as he stood. This is horse shit. 5 months ago, this same man said he heard nothing. Sit down, Sheriff, ordered Harrison Wells, the Reconstruction-appointed circuit clerk. His Boston accent cut through the heavy air. The witness will continue. Silas's voice stayed level. Pruitt was drunk. I could smell it from 30 feet. He kept saying she needed discipline for shorting his payments. Said he'd show her what happens to disobedient women. Reams' pen scratched steadily. And then they went into the barn. I took my boy and we went home, locked our door. Silas finally looked up. Next morning, Pruitt was gone. Mrs. Ash paid us early that week, in coin instead of credit at the store. Sheriff Tabor spat into his handkerchief. Convenient story. Now there's federal attention. Why didn't you report this in January? You know why, Sheriff, Silas replied quietly. Colored man's word against a white widow. In Mason Hollow. Wells nodded to Reams. Deputy, prepare a telegraph to Franklinton. We need confirmation about Pruitt's alleged arrival. He pulled a fresh document from his desk. And post new reward notices. $50 for information leading to resolution. This is my jurisdiction, Tabor protested. You can't just... I can and I am, Wells interrupted. Under Reconstruction statutes, any case involving federal appointees falls under circuit court authority. Pruitt was a government overseer. Reams finished the telegraph form and handed it to a waiting messenger. The boy's boots echoed down the hallway as Wells continued. "We'll need doctor." Cobb's official testimony about that feeding trough. The bone markings match his initial description too precisely to ignore. He drafted rapidly on thick legal paper, the formal language flowing from his pen. By order of the Circuit Court of Lincoln County, Mississippi, Dr. Elias Cobb is hereby commanded to appear regarding the examination of livestock facilities at Ash Farm, conducted January 5, 1871. Wells signed with a flourish and pressed his seal into red wax. "Deliver this to Doctor." Cobb's residence immediately. He looked up at Silas. "You're free to go, Mr. Nash. We may need you again." Silas rose, placing his hat carefully on his head. He paused at the door. "She ain't an evil woman, Mrs. Ash. Sometimes survival looks like sin to those who never had to choose." The sawmill smoke thickened outside as Silas descended the courthouse steps. Behind him, the subpoena for Doctor. Cobb lay drying on Wells's desk, the red wax seal bright as a drop of fresh blood. June 6, 1871. Morning light filtered through the dusty windows of Dr. Elias Cobb's home office, casting long shadows across his worn oak desk. His trembling hands opened the leather-bound medical ledger, its pages yellow with age and tobacco stains. The unsealed letter from January 5th lay exactly where he'd left it, pressed between accounts of winter fever and a difficult birth. Cobb adjusted his wire-rimmed spectacles and began to read. To the Office of County Coroner, Lincoln County, Mississippi, regarding examination of livestock facilities at Ash Farm, conducted January 5th, 1871. Upon inspection of the feeding trough and adjacent slurry pit, I observed significant quantities of coagulated matter consistent with human tissue. The blood patterns suggest arterial spray rather than standard butchering practices. Of particular note were fragments of adipose tissue bearing tool marks inconsistent with hog consumption. A knock at the door interrupted his reading. Deputy Reams entered, followed by Judge Aurelius Reed, their boots leaving mud on Cobb's carpet. "Doctor," Reed said, removing his hat, "we need your professional opinion on some evidence." Cobb cleared his throat, suppressing a smoker's cough. "The bone from the Nash boy?" Reams placed the wrapped bundle on the desk. Cobb unwound the oilcloth with practiced care, revealing the scored calf bone and rusted spur. His hands steadied as he lifted the bone to the morning light. "I treated similar injuries at Antietam," Cobb said, tracing the angular cut with his finger. "Field amputation, using a carpenter's saw. The marking pattern is distinctive. Clean entry, diagonal pressure marks, then a final snap." He reached for his medical satchel, still stained with battlefield mud, and withdrew a small leather case. Inside lay surgical sketches from the war. "Compare the striation patterns," he continued, laying the drawings beside the bone. "See these parallel grooves? They're nearly identical to documented cases where we had to process battlefield casualties quickly." He paused, swallowing hard. This was no pig's doing. This was methodical butchery. Judge Reed leaned forward, squinting at the evidence. "You're certain?" "As certain as I was in January." Cobb retrieved the unsent letter. "I documented my initial findings here. I regret my silence at the time." "Why didn't you submit this officially?" Reams asked. Cobb's hands resumed their trembling. "Sheriff Tabor made it clear. A widow's word carried weight. And after the war, well, some of us grew too comfortable with looking away." Judge Reed accepted the letter, scanning its contents. This matches the new evidence precisely. He pulled out his pocket watch, checking the time. Dr. Cobb, I'll need your sworn testimony at a preliminary hearing. We'll establish probable cause for a full trial. When? Cobb asked. Next month, July 1st. Reed tucked the letter into his coat. We'll need you to explain these markings to a jury. Can you speak to the similarities between battlefield wounds and what you found at Ash Farm? Cobb nodded slowly. I can demonstrate using my war records. The bone tells a clear story, if you know how to read it. Very well. Reed replaced his hat. July 1st, 9 o'clock, Brookhaven Courthouse. He paused at the door. And doctor? Bring everything, every note, every sketch. The truth's been buried long enough. After they left, Cobb sat alone in his office, staring at the bone still lying on his desk. He could smell the iron tang of old blood, hear the rasp of sore teeth. Memories of war mixing with newer, darker questions about what exactly had happened that January night in Mason Hollow. June 10th, 1871. The Wesson Tavern's wooden floors creaked under Deputy Jethro Reams's boots as he pushed through the midday heat. Tobacco smoke hung thick in the air, mingling with the sour remnants of last night's whiskey. Behind the scarred oak bar, Timothy Glenn methodically wiped glasses with a yellowed cloth, his eyes darting toward the deputy's brass star. "Mr. Glenn," Reams said, removing his hat. "Need to discuss your January records." Glenn's hand paused mid-wipe. "Been 6 months since then, Deputy. Memory ain't what it was. Not asking for memory." Reams placed his notebook on the bar. "Looking for a specific ledger page. January 3rd. The barkeep's weathered face tightened. He set down the glass, careful not to make noise. The few morning patrons hunched deeper over their drinks, suddenly fascinated by the contents of their cups. "That'd be private business records," Glenn said, voice low. "County business now." Reams pulled out a formal requisition notice. "Judge Reed's authority. That page could confirm a murder suspect's whereabouts." Glenn's eyes flicked to the back room, then to the door. "Ain't looking to make trouble with local folk." "Already trouble, Tim. Question is whether you're part of it or helping solve it." The barkeep exhaled slowly, shoulders dropping. He reached beneath the counter and produced a tin cash box, its corners dented from years of use. The key scraped in the lock. "Kept it separate," Glenn muttered, withdrawing a folded sheet of paper from beneath the day's earnings. "Figured somebody'd come asking eventually." Reams smoothed the page on the bar. The paper was torn along one edge, clearly ripped from a bound ledger. The handwriting was cramped but legible, recording the night's transactions in precise columns. Near the bottom, a single line stood out. "EP, 4 whiskies, 1 hour barn, Ash." "That's your writing?" Reams asked, though he recognized Glenn's distinctive curved letters from years of property tax records. "Yes, sir. Wrote it myself, same as every night." Glenn tapped the page with a thick finger. "Pruitt was in fine form that evening, bragging about some business up at Ash Farm. Said he had to teach respect to the widow. Why'd you remove this page?" Glenn's fingers drummed nervously on the bar. "Next morning, heard he'd gone missing. Few days after, Sheriff Tabor comes through, saying not to cause fuss about white folks' business. But I kept the page. Man drinks 4 whiskies, talks about teaching respect, then vanishes. Figured that paper might matter someday." Reams nodded, sliding the requisition form across the bar. "Need you to sign. confirming this is your original record, your handwriting. Glenn picked up the pen, hesitated. Ash widows got friends in county offices. Powerful friends. Had friends, Reams corrected. Things change. Sign. The pen scratched against paper. Reams carefully folded both documents, sealed them in an evidence envelope, and marked the time and date. Anything else you remember about that night? He asked. Just that Pruitt left heading north. Toward Ash Farm, Glenn picked up another glass. Never saw him again. Reams tucked the envelope into his coat and replaced his hat. Appreciate your cooperation. Back in Brookhaven, Judge Reed examined the tavern page, comparing it to the other evidence. Doctor, Cobb's medical letter, the carved bone, the peddler's meat trading log. After several minutes, he pulled out an official form and began to write. By authority of this court, pursuant to evidence now entered, I hereby authorize the immediate arrest of Josephine Ash. His signature flowed across the bottom of the page, dark ink gleaming in the afternoon light. September 3rd, 1871. The sun hadn't yet burned through the morning fog when 3 carriages rolled up the mud-rutted drive to Ash Farm. Deputy Reams sat rigid beside Sheriff Tabor in the lead wagon, watching mist curl off the fence posts. Behind them, 4 other deputies shifted uneasily, their rifles across their laps. The property stood quiet, too quiet. No smoke rose from the tenant cabins, no workers moved in the fields. Only the distant grunt of pigs broke the stillness. She'll run, Tabor muttered, flexing his arthritic hands on the reins. Women like that, when cornered, he stopped short. There, on the front porch of the main house, sat Josephine Ash. She wore her customary black dress, lace gloves folded in her lap, hair pulled severe against her skull. A silver cross gleamed at her throat. She might have been waiting for Sunday callers. Reams touched the warrant in his coat pocket. "Ma'am," he called out, stepping down from the wagon. "We have business with you." "The Lord's business comes first, Deputy." Josephine's voice carried clear across the yard. She held up a small leather Bible. "I was just reading Judges. About Jael and the tent peg. How God delivers his people from tormentors." The deputies spread out, hands near their weapons. But Josephine made no move to flee. She simply sat, pale and composed, as Reams mounted the porch steps. "Mrs. Ash," he said, "by order of Judge Reed, you're under arrest for the murder of Edgar Pruitt." "Murder implies sin," she replied. "There was no sin in what I did. Only justice." From the surrounding cabins, faces appeared in doorways. Silas Nash stood in his threshold, one hand on his son's shoulder. Other tenant families gathered silently, keeping their distance. Reams produced iron manacles. "Your hands, ma'am." Josephine extended, her wrists with almost ritual grace. The cuffs clicked shut. "The county gave him authority over my land," she said. "But they didn't give him authority over my body. Or my soul." She rose smoothly, still clutching her Bible. As Reams guided her down the steps, she turned toward the cluster of tenant cabins. Young Thaddeus Nash stared back, his father's hand tight on his shoulder. "Feed the pigs early," Josephine called to him. "They always prefer meat warm." A shudder passed through the watching families. Mothers pulled children inside. Doors clicked shut. The journey to Brookhaven passed in tense silence. Josephine sat straight-backed in the wagon, eyes fixed ahead, lips moving in what might have been prayer. Once, passing the swamp where the bone was found, she smiled faintly. At the jailhouse, she surrendered her Bible and gloves without protest. The cell was bare except for a narrow cot and a tin chamber pot. Iron bars cast zebra shadows across the floor. "Do you wish to make a statement?" Reams asked, preparing to lock the door. "Only that God's justice works through many hands," Josephine replied. "Even mine." The key turned. Through the bars, she looked almost peaceful, hands folded at her waist where the manacles had been. Behind her calm face, Reams thought he glimpsed something else, something that made him grateful for the iron between them. He left her there in the shadows, waiting for trial, still wearing her widow's black. September 28th, 1871. Heat pressed down on the converted church like a wet blanket. Through tall windows, afternoon light caught dust motes and circling flies. The wooden pews, now serving as gallery seating, creaked under the weight of what seemed like half of Brookhaven's population. Dr. Elias Cobb shifted uncomfortably in the witness box, his medical bag at his feet. Sweat darkened the collar of his linen coat as he held up his January letter. "The blood residue in the trough," he testified, wiping his spectacles, "contained particles consistent with human tissue. The marrow patterns in the recovered bone showed tool marks, deliberate scoring from a saw or similar implement." In the defendant's chair, Josephine Ash sat perfectly still. Her black dress absorbed the light, making her pale face float like a moon above the dark fabric. She held her Bible in gloved hands, unmarked by either strain or fear. Timothy Glenn, the Wesson tavern keeper, twisted his cap as he recounted Pruitt's last known hours. He had 4 whiskies, said he was heading to Ash Farm to teach respect. Wrote it right here in the ledger. See where it says, "Barn Hour." That was his last entry. Reverend Poole spoke next, his voice soft but carrying to every corner. "The boy brought me the bone and spur. I recognized the scoring, similar to marks I'd seen in my days tending graves. This was no animal's work." He glanced at Josephine. She met his gaze steadily, almost serene. When Silas Nash took the stand, his hands shook. "I saw Mr. Pruitt drag her toward the barn. She wasn't willing. I heard," he swallowed hard, "I heard sounds of struggle. Then quiet. He never came out again." The defense counsel, Augustus Wheeler, rose with theatrical confidence. "The prosecution lacks a body. My client, a respectable widow, was threatened with violation. If Mr. Pruitt met his end that night, was it not justified defense of virtue?" Judge Reed, perspiring beneath his black robe, called for order as murmurs rippled through the gallery. The afternoon light slanted lower, painting copper streaks across the floorboards. District Attorney Harrison Tate laid out his evidence methodically. The bloodied trough, the bone with its telling marks, the spur bearing Pruitt's initials, the peddler's ledger confirming suspicious meat trades, the tavern's final entry. "Consider the sequence," Tate urged the jury. "A man enters her property. He vanishes. Fresh pork appears. The evidence speaks clearly of premeditated disposal. Through it all, Josephine maintained her composure. When asked to speak in her defense, she stood, Bible pressed to her heart. "I am a God-fearing woman," she said, voice clear as chapel bells. "The Lord delivers his children from evil. What happened in that barn was his will, worked through my hands." The gallery stirred uneasily. Several women crossed themselves. As the sun touched the horizon, Judge Reed addressed the 12 men of the jury, 9 white, 3 black. "You will consider the evidence presented. You will weigh testimony against fact. You will return tomorrow with your verdict." The bailiff led them out. Through the windows, tobacco gold light caught Josephine's face. For a moment, she looked almost translucent, a figure carved from alabaster. Then shadow swept across the church, and she became once more a widow in mourning, waiting for judgment. The gallery emptied slowly, people filing past the defendant's chair with a wide berth. As darkness gathered, the bailiff led Josephine back to her cell, her Bible still clutched tight, her steps measured and unhurried. Dawn crept over Brookhaven like a grey shroud. Church bells pierced the thick fog, their iron song drawing people through the mist toward the converted courthouse. Inside, oil lamps cast weak circles of light against the gloom. Josephine Ash sat ramrod straight in her chair, hands folded over her Bible. Her black dress seemed to absorb what little light reached her, making her pale face float disconnected in the shadows. The gallery filled quickly, breath and bodies warming the damp air. At precisely 7 o'clock, Judge Reed entered, his robes heavy with moisture from the short walk between buildings. The jury filed in behind him, their faces drawn with sleepless deliberation. The foreman, a wheat farmer named Jacob Whitmore, held a single sheet of paper. "Have you reached a verdict?" Judge Reed's voice carried clearly through the hushed room. "We have, Your Honor." Whitmore's hands trembled slightly as he unfolded the paper. "We find the defendant, Josephine Ash, guilty of voluntary manslaughter." A wave of whispers swept through the gallery. Josephine remained still, only her fingers tightening on the Bible's leather cover. Judge Reed raised his gavel for silence. "Josephine Ash, please rise." She stood with fluid grace, her chains chiming softly. "For the crime of voluntary manslaughter, this court sentences you to life labor at Greenville Work Farm." The gavel fell with a sharp crack. The gallery erupted. "Hanging's too good for her," someone shouted from the back. "She protected her virtue," came another voice. A woman in the front pew began to weep. "Southern justice," spat a freedman near the door. "White woman kills white man, keeps her neck." Deputies moved to clear the room as Judge Reed called for order. Through it all, Josephine stood unmoved, like a black granite monument to her own conviction. That evening, as purple dusk settled over the jailhouse, Reverend Poole's boots echoed on the flagstone floor. He found Josephine seated on her cot, still clutching her Bible. "Have you come to hear my confession, Reverend?" Her voice was steady, almost amused. "I've come to offer comfort to your soul," he replied, standing before her cell. Josephine's fingers traced the Bible's gilt edges. "The Lord is my shepherd," she recited. "I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures." Her dark eyes met his. "My conscience is clear before God, Reverend. No need for earthly absolution." Poole studied her face in the failing light. "The Lord's forgiveness requires genuine repentance." "Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord," she countered softly. "He simply chose to work through my hands." Dawn broke cold and clear the next morning. A prison wagon waited outside the jailhouse, its iron-bound wheels crushing frost-wilted weeds. 2 guards helped Josephine up into the cage, her chains singing with each movement. She settled onto the wooden bench, still wearing her widow's black, still holding her Bible. As the wagon lurched forward toward Greenville, she turned her face to the rising sun, her expression serene as a saint's. The watching crowd parted like water around a stone as the wagon rolled past, some blessing themselves, others turning away. Church bells began to toll again, marking the hour of her departure, their bronze voices following the wagon until it disappeared into the morning mist. The prison wagon creaked along the muddy river road north of Yazoo Bend, its wheels spinning treacherously in the deepening ruts. Rain had been falling steadily since midnight, turning the clay-rich soil into a deadly slick surface. Guard Samuel Whitaker held the reins with white-knuckled hands, while his partner Thomas Reed huddled beneath an oilcloth, watching their lone prisoner through the cage bars. Josephine Ash sat perfectly still on the wooden bench, her Bible clutched to her chest. The rain had soaked through her black dress, plastering it to her thin frame, but she showed no sign of discomfort. Her eyes remained fixed on some distant point ahead, her lips moving in silent prayer or contemplation. "Might want to slow it down," Reed called out to Whitaker. "This hill's looking mighty unstable." The wagon wheels churned deeper into the mud as they began their ascent. To their right, the river churned brown and angry 20 feet below. To their left, the sodden hillside loomed, streams of red clay washing across their path. A crack like rifle fire split the air. Whitaker yanked the reins as a massive oak, its roots undermined by the deluge, began to slide toward them. The horses reared in panic, their hooves finding no purchase on the slippery ground. "Hold on!" Whitaker shouted, but it was too late. The wagon tilted sickeningly as the hillside gave way beneath it. Reed managed to leap clear, rolling into a drainage ditch. Whitaker was thrown from his seat, but caught himself on a young sapling. The wagon, with Josephine still locked inside, tumbled once, twice, then came to rest upside down. The rear axle had snapped, crushing the cage beneath its weight. Through the curtain of rain, Reed could see a pale hand protruding from the wreckage, still clutching the sodden Bible. It took 3 hours for help to arrive from the nearest town. Dr. Elias Cobb, summoned by a breathless messenger, found the scene already growing cold in the late afternoon gloom. The rain had finally stopped, leaving everything draped in a glistening sheen of red mud. "The guards?" he asked the sheriff's deputy who'd arrived before him. "Bruised and shaken, but alive," the deputy replied, gesturing to where Whitaker and Reed sat wrapped in borrowed blankets. The prisoner wasn't so fortunate. Cobb approached the wreckage, his medical bag heavy in his hand. The wagon had been righted, revealing what remained of Josephine Ash. The rear axle had caught her across the chest and face, rendering her nearly unidentifiable. Her black dress was now stained the same red as the clay that had claimed her. With methodical care, Cobb recorded his observations in his field notebook, noting the position of the body and the nature of the injuries. The Bible she'd carried lay nearby, its pages swollen with river water, its leather cover stained crimson. 2 days later, in the warmth of his office, Cobb opened the county medical register. His pen scratched quietly across the page as he made the final entry for Josephine Ash. October 3rd, 1871. Death by misadventure on Yazoo Bend Road. Crushed. No embalming. No known kin. Morning light filtered through the dusty windows of Brookhaven Baptist Church as Sarah Whitman sorted through the spring donation boxes. At 63, her fingers moved slowly but deliberately through the pile of old clothing, damaged hymnals, and miscellaneous papers that congregated at the bottom of the wooden chest. Her weathered hands paused over a leather-bound book, its spine cracked and pages warped from years of humidity. The book's cover bore the faded stamp of the Wesson Tavern, its pages filled with the careful columns of daily receipts and purchases spanning the years 1870 to 1871. "Reverend Poole," she called out, her voice echoing in the empty church. "You might want to see this." The Reverend appeared from his study, wire-rimmed spectacles perched on his nose. He recognized the book immediately. Timothy Glenn's old receipt ledger from the tavern, the same one that had featured so prominently in the Ash Widow's trial. It must have been mixed in with Glenn's estate donations, Poole said, taking the book from Sarah's trembling hands. "He passed last winter, if I recall correctly." Together they moved to a pew where the morning light was stronger. The ledger fell open naturally to a loose page tucked between its sheets. The paper was yellow with age, but the ink remained clear enough to read. January 5th, 1871, 9:45 p.m. EP, 4 whiskies, 2 bits. 10 p.m. SN, scratched through. 1 whiskey, 6 cents. 10:15 p.m. EP leaves for Ash Barn. Sarah's breath caught. SN. Could that be? Silas Nash, Poole finished quietly. He traced the scratched-out initials with his finger. Or perhaps his boy, Thaddeus. Though he'd have been awful young to be at the tavern. The timing changed everything. Josephine Ash had testified that Pruitt arrived at her farm before 9 that evening. Yet here was evidence of him drinking well past that hour. And more importantly, evidence that someone else, someone whose initials had been deliberately obscured, had been there too. Reverend Poole studied the page closer, holding it up to the light. The scratches over the SN appeared to have been made with a different pen, the ink slightly darker than the original entry. Someone had tried to hide this detail, but not hard enough to destroy the page entirely. This would have mattered at trial, Sarah whispered, though there was no one else in the church to hear. If there was someone else involved. 3 years too late for that, Poole replied. He carefully folded the page and slipped it into an envelope. The widow's gone, either way. God rest her soul. The Reverend wrote out a brief cover letter explaining where and how the page had been discovered. He sealed both documents and addressed the envelope to the county recorder's office in his neat script. Sarah watched him work, her hands folded in her lap. Will they reopen the case? For what purpose? Poole shook his head. The main players are all dead or gone. Pruitt never found, Josephine buried up near Yazoo, and the Nash family moved west after the trial. He stood, tucking the envelope into his coat pocket. Some secrets are better left to rest with the dead. Later that afternoon, the envelope arrived at the recorder's office. The clerk logged it without comment, filed it in the closed case records, and never spoke of its contents. The ledger page joined the other artifacts of the Ash Farm tragedy, a rusted spur, a scored bone, and a collection of testimonies that told only part of the truth. A cold mist clung to the bottomlands as Thaddeus Nash worked the fence line where Ash Farm's property once met the swamp. At 16, his shoulders had broadened from farm work, but his eyes retained their watchful quality, taking in everything while revealing nothing. The wooden posts needed replacing where rot had set in. Each time he drove his shovel into the earth, the ground gave way with an unnatural softness. Even after 3 years, the soil here refused to settle properly. The morning's fog amplified the grunting of distant pigs from neighboring farms, making them sound closer than they were. Thaddeus paused to wipe sweat from his brow, though the air was cool. His gaze drifted to the water's edge, where cattails had overtaken the old sluice gate. Nature had reclaimed most traces of what happened here. The pig pen, where he'd spent countless hours helping his father clean and feed the animals, was now just a depression in the earth. its timber walls long since collapsed and hauled away. A cluster of local boys had tried to rebuild it last spring, but the ground wouldn't hold the posts. "Bad earth," the older folks said, crossing themselves. No one wanted to speak about why. As he worked, Thaddeus's boot struck something hard beneath the soil. He knelt down, fingers probing the mud until they found a smooth, curved surface. For a moment, his heart quickened, but it was just a piece of old crockery, probably washed down from someone's trash pile. He'd found other things over the years: buttons, a belt buckle, scraps of leather, but never what everyone assumed must be there, scattered by scavengers or dissolved in the swamp's acidic waters. The pigs had been thorough in their work. The community had developed its own ways of avoiding the subject. When neighbors spoke of that time, they referred to it only as the trouble at the old place, or that business with the widow. Never her name, never the details. But Thaddeus remembered everything. The sound of the barn door that night, his father's whispered warnings to stay in bed, the way the pigs squealed differently for weeks after. He straightened up, testing the new fence post. The wood was solid oak, but already it listed slightly, as if the ground itself was slowly digesting it. A crow called from the cypress trees, making him start. These days, unexpected sounds still set his nerves on edge. Moving down the fence line, Thaddeus came to the spot where he'd found the bone and spur that summer. The water was higher now, dark and still. He stood at the edge, watching his reflection fragment in the ripples. His lips moved, forming words he'd never spoken aloud to anyone but the swamp. They never found the teeth. Later that evening, Reverend Poole sat in his study, adding a final entry to his daily journal. The lamplight cast long shadows as he wrote, "Some secrets rot, others root." He closed the book without elaborating further.